I'm very distracted now. Okay, Abraham means the father of many nations, right? And the thing about it is that, like, the father of many, right? The father of nations. And that's such like a mind-boggling like thing, because everybody would have been looking at him and looking at his wife, who was too old to have kids, and being like, are you sure that you're the father of nations? You know? And Abraham made like a ton of mistakes, you know, and like I said, he was a mess like most of the time, but he had so much faith. He had so much trust that God was going to do what he said. And that's an incredible thing. And so it's important that we know what God is calling us to, but that we walk in that, regardless of what it's going to look like, even if we don't have the promise right then. Okay? And kind of the last thing I'm going to say about this, for now, is in chapter 17, verse 15 to 16. Yes. It says, then God said to Abram, regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah, and I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. King will be among her descendants. And what I want to say about this is that God's calling is not just for us. When God calls us, when he changes our names, you know, this is something that's going to change the people. It's going to change your families. It's going to make an impact in your families. And God is really efficient this way. You know, not that he doesn't treat us individually, not that like our blessings aren't unique and individual, because that's how he treats us. But also he never wastes an opportunity. So when he's changing me, he's changing the people around me as well. You know, he's using those opportunities because he has the great like ability to do so. You know, so he will always use the things that he's put in you and called you to be a catalyst for change and growth and new life in the lives of your families and the people around you. Okay, this is clear? Yes? Amazing. So I'm going to talk about Abraham like a little bit more later, but for now, Sergio. Yeah.
Back to me. Okay, now we're going to talk about Samuel. I feel like I said really wrong his name. Samuel. Okay. If I keep repeating, it gets weirder.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
Samuel. Samuel. Okay. 1 Samuel 3, from 3 to 10. The whole section is until the 21, but for now we're gonna go through 10. Samuel was a really cool kid. Then became a really cool guy and a really like a sir with a lot of authority. He was a really like a man that God used, and he has a really amazing story, you know. And I confess that it's like the Bible school kind of stories that you hear, but when you really like read the story afterwards and you realize like the tiny stuff that happens, the very beginning was already hard for him, you know. So I'm gonna read here 1 Samuel 3. The boy Samuel ministered before Eli. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. One night, Eli, whose eyes were becoming so weak that he could barely see, was lying down in his usual place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the house of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called Samuel. Samuel answered, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I did not call you. Go back and lie down." So he went and lay down. Again the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me, my son." Eli said, "Please let me sleep. I did not call. Go back and lie down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called Samuel. And Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am. You called me." Then Eli realized that the Lord was calling the boy. So Eli told Samuel, "Go and lie down, and if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. The Lord came and stood there, calling as at the other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Then Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." Just to say, Samuel was a kid here. I don't really know the age, but he was under 10 years old, you know. Just a little bit of background. His mom, she was
Yeah.
sterile. So she asked for God to give her a son, and she really asked for this miracle. And she said that, like, if she would give birth a son, a kid, she would give to the Lord. She would like give the kid to serve the Lord. And God gave her a kid. And 1 year, 2 years later, she came and brought him to serve at the temple. So she gave him to Eli. And the thing is, like, he was really a tiny kid, maybe 7, 8 years old, and God came to talk with him, and he was serving at the temple, but he still didn't know God, you know. And like they said in the text, the voice of God was rare there because the people of God was doing all the kinds of craps. They were like really going the opposite side of God's will, and that's the kind of the context. And I'm gonna talk about Eli later, but Eli wasn't as well doing a really good job, and he was the priest. But yeah, just to put a topic here, sometimes you don't recognize the voice of God, and like going back to what we were talking about. But he was really patient. He is patient with us. So he called Samuel 3 times, and Samuel didn't know who was speaking with him. And then at the fourth time, he heard Lord, the voice of the Lord, and was available. And like one thing that I want to talk about here is about the mentorship, like Rebecca mentioned. Eli was his mentor by this moment. Like God was talking with Samuel, and Samuel didn't know what to do, what was happening, and Eli guided him. And this is like something that we need to rely on people. And this is like something that I want to tell you guys. The voice of God is the main voice that we need to listen. But we need to have trustworthy people so we can find guidance and advices. And like particularly here in Wyman has the discipleship. I mean, that's the name of the school, discipleship training school. And we have our disciples to help us. They're not gonna have the answers always. They're not God, but they can help like from a different perspective. Sometimes going from the outside, see the bigger picture, you know, and they can guide and they can like help us to go to the ways that we can go and meet God and His voice, you know. So that's why that's what Eli did. He helped, and it's funny because even Eli, because of the things were happening, he didn't recognize God's voice at first, and then afterwards he realized. But he still was able to help Samuel. It was something that was really key as well, is that he had the heart to listen what God was saying, because he could just listen to God's voice and say, "Okay, you're talking with me." But no, he took the action and said, "I'm here. Your servant is listening. Talk to me." So yeah, mentorship is really important. Like we were saying, we have our discipler, and Eli was able to help him. Let me see here. already talked about this. I realized that I was talking about my topics without original topics. That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and something that I think I told before, but just to say again, like Samuel, he was working for God already, but he was in a place that like he didn't really know God. So he received some signs from God, like God called him, and he didn't know what to do, but at least he had the heart, you know. Um, yeah, and here the things like Samuel, he was serving at the temple because like his mom promised him to serve, and this is not like what he chose, you know. And sometimes we don't get to choose. Like God brings us our calling, and it's not that I'm gonna pick between five things. I'm gonna get the best for me, you know. And like he was serving there, but God came to him, and he was available to bring a bigger thing for him to do. So he was promised as a priest. He will be working and helping the priest that was Eli, but God called him to be a prophet. You know, so like the text that we read was the first part that God was calling him, and then the first thing that God asked Samuel to do is to deliver a word that was for Eli. So that's just his first call. You know, and let me go here and find my notes. Yeah, I'm gonna go to the passage to show what was the call for Samuel, the first one. From verse 11. I'm gonna start, and then when I stop, I tell you guys it. And the Lord said to Samuel, "See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of everyone who hears of it tingle. At that time, I will carry out against Eli everything I spoke against his family, from beginning to end. For I told him that I would judge his family forever because of the sin he knew about. His sons made themselves contemptible, and he failed to restrain them. Therefore, I swear to the house of Eli, the guilt of Eli's house will never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering." And this is like the word that God gave to Samuel. And the thing is, like Eli was a priest, and by that time it was passed from father to son. So to be a priest, you were born in a family to be a priest. That started there with Aaron, Moses' brother. He was the first priest, and the lineage went. And sometimes you can have you can have sons that will work for God, and sometimes you can have sons like Eli that were just doing all the wrong things, and they were doing like pretty ugly things. And God was telling Eli, "You need to correct your sons." And Eli was just telling them off instead of really correcting. And that came afterwards. God put his hand on him, and he said, "Okay, after you, your family is not gonna keep doing this. Your house will be destroyed." And like his lineage stopped there. His lineage, the word?
Yeah.
His lineage stopped there. And that's what God asked Samuel to do, to say. So the guy that was guiding him, the one that he has been helping the whole time, basically his disciple, he had to tell him that his family would be destroyed, and he wouldn't be after him. His family wouldn't be a family anymore. So it's like, okay, the guy that just helped me to hear God's voice, I'm gonna have to tell him that he's over. So and for a kid of maybe 8 years old, you know, I don't know if because he was a kid he could just go and say, I would be freaking out, to be honest. And then he goes. I'm gonna read now the verse 15. Samuel lay down until morning and then opened the doors of the house of the Lord. He was afraid to tell Eli. He was afraid to tell Eli the vision, but Eli called him and said, "Samuel, my son." Samuel answered, "Here I am." "What was it that he said to you?" Eli asked. "Do not hide it from me. May God deal with you, be it ever so severely, if you hide me from anything he told you." So Samuel told him everything, hiding nothing from him. Then Eli said, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." So that was the first thing that God called him to do, and he didn't run away from it. And like just a side comment, some people got called to be prophets, to speak over people, and I think most of the times it could be really scary to deliver a word to someone that it's not the best thing to say, but it's not up to us to choose if it's good or not. Like God is asking us to do something, we do, and from after we deliver, it's between that person and God. So Samuel could just hide or just deliver the message kind of like a sugar colored, or just giving not the full message, but that's not what he did. And yeah, that's the thing about Samuel. And also, like, summarizing, Samuel, he told raised as a priest, he was called to be a prophet, charged with announcing God's word to Israel, because that was just the beginning. He told this to Eli, and afterwards, after Eli's death, God raised him as a prophet of the people. So he was the leader of Israel after this, to announce the God's word to Israel. So because of Samuel and his heart, God was again talking with the people of Israel. So from a rare voice of God during Eli's time and even before, God started to talk again, because Samuel was there to serve God and to work for him and to go for the calling. Yeah, ironically, the first prophetic act was to announce the destruction of Eli. And he sought the Lord and was found of him. Samuel begins this chapter ministering to the Lord, as we say in 1 Samuel 3, verse 1, but not knowing him, that we see on verse 7. But by the end of the chapter, God revealed himself to Samuel. That was in the verse 21 that I'm going to read here. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, and there he revealed himself to Samuel through his word. So that was the call of Samuel. And by the way, I forgot to say, we're going to be bringing a lot of people here, a lot of a name of characters from the Bible. And we kind of put those guys in one section. But for example, they have many layers. So for example, you can talk about David. He's not going to be just a guy who obeyed. He did a lot of stuff happen to him, but we're just going to kind of narrow some names in just one specific thing, but they did much more. And because now I'm going to talk with David. Yeah, was a spoiler.
My turn?
Oh, no, it's your turn. No, just before I did this. Yeah, he understood what God was saying. Sorry, it's not me. It's Rebecca. Go, Rebecca.
We're taking turns. No. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about a couple different people here, but we're going to start with Isaiah. So in Isaiah 6, 1-9, I just forget that Isaiah and Jeremiah are after Psalms in the Bible. I'm always looking for them in the wrong place. Anyway, yes, Isaiah 6, 1-9. So it was in the year King Uzziah died that I saw the Lord. So Isaiah obviously wrote the book. So first person it's Isaiah. Okay. So he saw the Lord. He was sitting on a lofty throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Attending him were mighty seraphim, each having 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they flew. They were calling out to each other, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is filled with his glory." Their voices shook the temple to its foundations, and the entire building was filled with smoke. Then I said, "It is all over. I am doomed, for I am a sinful man. I have filthy lips, and I live among people with filthy lips. Yet I have seen the King, the Lord of heaven's armies." Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a burning coal he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched my lips with it and said, "See, this coal has touched your lips. Now your guilt is removed and your sins are forgiven." Then I heard the Lord asking, "Whom should I send as a messenger to this people? Who will go for us?" And I said, "Here I am, send me." And he said, "Yes, go and say this to the people." And then he gives his message. But I love this passage, actually. I knew I was going to use it when we were talking about calling, like the first time, but then when I started reading it over, I just realized like how kind of hilarious it is, actually, because Isaiah's like a very dramatic guy, you know, like throughout his whole ministry, he keeps doing like these things where he's like, "Everybody listen to it," you know, like he's so extreme, and it's so funny. But his reaction was, and it's obviously this version that puts the words this way, but most of them are like, I like, woe is me, you know, I'm gonna die. But this one just says like, "It's all over, I'm doomed," you know. And I was like, Isaiah, you gotta calm down, you know. But it's so true that like in that context, in that like time frame, you know, seeing the Lord was actually a death sentence, because we're very broken and unholy people, so you can't be in the presence of holiness, you know. It was during the time where, like, you know, the priests, so when the priest had to go into the Holy of Holies, they would like tie a rope around him so that if he was struck down by the presence of God, they could like pull his body back out, you know. Nobody else had to go inside. This was like the context that he comes from, right? So he sees God and he's like, "Oh no, like I am not pure. I do not know, like I didn't even go through the rituals, like I'm broken," you know. And he had such like an awareness of the fact that he was too full of sin to be anywhere near God, you know. And like that like humility that he had in that sense, you know. What I actually love about Isaiah is that he was already in the temple serving, right? Like he was a priest. He wasn't like Samuel, you know, he wasn't a kid. He had already had like this career and this vocation, and he was already serving, right? So when God said like, "Who will I send?" Isaiah could have said like, "Actually, I'm already serving you, so maybe you should get somebody who's not as busy," or something, you know. And I feel like we do that a lot, you know. We're like, "Well, I can't go and do that thing that you called me to do because can't you see that I'm already working in the church, or I'm already, you know, a missionary at this base, or I'm all," you know, it's like these things. But like Isaiah's heart was so much for God that God said like, "Who should I send?" He didn't start by saying like, "Who should I send because I have this message, and if you like it, then you can choose to say it or not." You know, he was just like, "Who do I send?" And Isaiah jumps up and he's like, me. Like, send me, absolutely me. You know, like he grabbed that opportunity with like both hands. You know, he was like, "I need to be a part of this." It wasn't like, "Oh, well, maybe if I like the message, maybe, you know, if I have time, whatever." No, he was like, "This is something I have to do," you know. And like I said, like I love that he didn't know like with clarity what God was going to send him to do. He was just like, for whatever it is, I'm in. And I love also that like God had already equipped Isaiah for the missions of being a prophet, right? Because Isaiah worked in the temple, right? Isaiah was familiar with a lot of things that other like people wouldn't have been familiar with because of his work that he'd already done. And sometimes like we're seeking for a calling, you know, like we're waiting for like God to like drop a banner across us that'll say like, "Here's what you have to do." But what God actually wants from us is to find us already serving, you know. Yeah, because God, like, and I feel like sometimes, like everybody's different, whatever. And some people, like Samuel, have that call like when they're so young, and then other times God shows up later and he's like, actually, I want you to use the things that you have for me, in this sense. And it's a completely different sense. But he was well equipped for it because he had been serving already, and he comes from that mindset and that context of serving people, and serving God. And remember that God uses the broken, right? Like Isaiah was right when he freaked out because he was a sinner and like he saw God and all this stuff. Like that reality is still true, but I think we let it stop us, But God's saying like, no, I see you. I know who you are. I know that you're broken, and I'm going to call you anyway. God didn't call the priest that was in the holiest of holies after he'd been purified. He called Isaiah, who was just, doing his life serving. That's it, And then God cleansed him so that he could use him, right? But when God approached him, he was broken. But what Isaiah had was a willing heart to say yes, even though he knew how broken he was. And even though his lips had to be literally burned with fire before he could speak the words of the Lord. Isaiah had that heart that was willing to say yes to God, no matter what it was and no matter what it would take. Okay. The perspective of God starts in reworking the bad things to good. Okay. The reconciling of you to God. We've already said that like God doesn't waste anything, right? Like he's very efficient. He knows what he's doing, and he knows everything that we're going to go through, right? So he's not a wasteful God. He just isn't, So the way that Isaiah was serving in the temple wasn't wrong. I think that's important to say. It wasn't his ultimate calling, and it wasn't what God had for him, like in the next season, and then the like seasons afterwards, because God had so much more for him. But it was something that God was going to use. Yeah, one of the God does this all the time, actually, is that he takes the things that we're already doing and then he makes them for him, and he uses them and he doesn't waste them. But one example of this is Luke, right? So Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, the disciple of Jesus, right? So Luke was a physician. So he was a doctor by trade before God called him, before Jesus specifically called him, And I love that because Luke's gospel is so different than the other gospels because it's like well known for having like the most emphasis on the healing miracles, right? Which he had so much more of a heart for because he knew illnesses, he knew people, And so when he saw Jesus show up and be like, bam, you're healed, he knew that it wasn't possible except for by the power of God. So he put that emphasis in his gospels for us to read, and I think it looks quite different than we think it should, We think like, oh, Luke was a doctor, he like figured out he was doing whatever. But God had more for him, even if it didn't look like it was more, In that context, to go from being a physician to being a follower of Christ, But I also know that that's the greatest calling that Luke could have received, And I know that what he wrote is so pivotal. I can't speak today. For all of us, It's so important that he had that emphasis and that he wrote from his perspective. So like we say, like God doesn't waste a single thing. sometimes we have a tendency to think like, oh, well, I'm not in the right place, or I'm not headed the right way. But God is going to use those things. I can actually give you a personal example of this, because I spent several years of my life like not knowing where my life was going, you know, and really frustrated at myself, because I was like, what I do is I go to work and then I come home and I sleep and then I go to work. And that was like my whole like existence for a couple of years. And during that time I worked at Starbucks, right? Which for me was like a dead end job. Like I knew it wasn't going anywhere, whatever. But I learned so many things there about like delegating tasks and about like how to deal with people. And then even about like making coffee that I use now on a daily basis, you know? And when God called me to work at this base here in London that has our own coffee shop, you know, like God wasn't messing around. You know, he was like, actually, all of these things that you thought were wasted, that frustrated you even, I'm going to use them, you know, because that's how good God is. He doesn't, yeah. I love that he's so good at turning all of those things to the good that he's going to do, you know, because he knows us so well. And he will always like turn our hearts towards the things that our calling is as well. So often we end up in like a vocation or whatever, like Luke did, you know, like he was a physician or whatever, but his calling was for more than that, you know, but he had that heart for healing before he saw the healing that Christ did. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Whitmore.
Like, as long as somebody is like, yes, then I'm happy. So, yeah. To be honest, like some of the times, God calls us not out of the situation, like I was explaining, where I was like, I feel like I'm not doing anything with my life, whatever. But actually, he calls us out of things that like we love doing, you know, things that we're like very invested in or we're really successful at, you know. And God will call us out of those things to his heart, and that's not losing. And I think that's really important, because sometimes people will look at our lives and they'll wonder like if we're going the right direction in that sense, because the worldly sense of success isn't God's sense of success. Because again, like when I came here, I owned my own house and I was working as like I design roofs and floors for houses, like my job. But I had like this career that like I was working towards, and I'd been doing it for like 6 years at that point, you know? And I was like successful in that sense. But when God called me to be a missionary, I was like, I gotta go, you know? Because for me, it was more important. But I have a lot of people in my life that say now, like, well, why don't you, like, when are you coming back to like, you know, get a job and like, you know, like all of those things. Because the world's sense of success isn't God's sense of success, okay? But we never lose when we follow Christ. He literally is the victory. So chasing after him will only ever be a victory, even if the worldly sense of success, you know, even if that's not where it looks like we're headed, you know, it's only natural that when you have like the revelation of this, that we like give up things for when we're called, you know, that we leave those things behind to chase Jesus instead. Yeah, I want to say, okay, so we're going to talk about Jeremiah, but first I want to talk about, well, I want to mention a verse in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 10. And the verse says basically like, whatever your hands find to do with your whole heart, or with all your strength. I think it says in a different translation. But this is a really important verse, because it doesn't matter where we're at in our walk. You know, if God puts something in front of us, we should be doing it with our whole hearts. You know, we should really be seizing those opportunities, because God's going to use them all. So yeah, and then we're going to talk about in Jeremiah 1, 4 till 10. So Jeremiah's story is quite similar to Samuel's. Okay, he's quite young. I don't think he's as young as Samuel was, but he's quite young. He's a priest, and he comes from a very long line of priests. It says in here, it's like, he's the son of this guy who's the son of this guy, who have all been priests, basically. It's like, yeah, it's a big thing. Anyway, so then verse 4 until 10 say, "The Lord gave me this message. I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart and appointed you as a prophet to the nations." "O sovereign Lord," I said, "I can't speak for you. I'm too young." The Lord replied, "Don't say I'm too young, for you must go wherever I send you and say whatever I tell you. And do not be afraid of the people, for I will be with you and I will protect you. I, the Lord, have spoken." Then the Lord reached out and touched my mouth and said, "Look, I have put my words in your mouth. Today I appoint you to stand up against nations and kingdoms. Some you must uproot and tear down, destroy and overthrow. Others you must build up and plant." So the thing about Jeremiah is that he already had this career, right? And the same way that Isaiah did, the same way that Samuel did. But even more so because his whole family were priests, right? So the thing that his family said actually had no weight on what God said, right? This was going probably since like his mom was pregnant. They were like, another priest for this, family, lineage, whatever. But God specifically says, like, before you were born, he's like, before you were in your mother's womb, right? That's when I saw you. That's when I called you. People always expect things from us, whether that's other people or it's our families or it's ourselves. We have these expectations. But don't get so set in your plans or your expectations, because God's plans for you were there first. They have, like when people always, like siblings or whatever, are like, "No, I was here first, therefore I get to stay here," and like the little fight. Literally, God was here first. Okay? Yeah, in the front seat. So God has that claim, where he's like, "Actually, I knew you first, and I knew my plans for you first." And maybe that's like, I don't know. It's not like a childish way to think of it, because it actually literally is what God says, And also in this same chapter, it says that like God's word outlasts even the word of kings, So God's claim was like very strong on his life, regardless of whatever else was going on. Also, Jeremiah was super young, right? But God isn't interested in excuses like that, because he already put in you what you need for the things that he'll call you to. Like we said, he knew you first. He knew you before you were born, before your parents or grandparents or whatever were born. And he's already been placing all of the things in you that you need. God isn't wasteful and he isn't forgetful. He wasn't like, "Oh man, I should have given her more patience. Whoops." Like that's not who God is. That's not something he would say. He's put in you everything that you need. And he knows better than like you'll ever know. Not just the things around you, but yourself. Yeah. Remember that like you were literally made for the things that God calls you for. So in the sense that like Jeremiah being trained as a priest and whatever, that helps him, like God uses everything. you know, but it in no way could stop him from what God had for his life, okay? God's calling is greater than all of the things that the world or anyone else tells us to be. Yeah, I think a lot of us live without like knowing who or why we are, you know. We chase after like things that we have seen that other people have or that we've been told that we should have. And even in the sense that like we can become envious of like the relationship that other people have with God. You know, we think like, oh, I have to be there, I have to relate to God in that one way, or, you know, like anything like this. But when we have this sense and we're thinking about like those kind of like false expectations, we don't, as it says in Song of Songs, it says like we need to tend to our own like inner gardens, right? Because we can't live in a way that we, you know, like we can't live in a way that has us looking after or chasing ours, you know, because God has so much more for us. We can't be like puppets on strings that are controlling what the world thinks. Like we need to be found in the truth of who we are in Christ. And that's exactly what Jeremiah does. God calls him, lays his claim to Jeremiah and says like, you were mine before you were theirs, so follow me. And Jeremiah does. And this is what we need to do as well. Yeah, we can't think of God or his calling as like a career or like a, you know, I do this for 8 hours a day kind of a thing where it's just like, oh, that's the one thing I did that one time, you know. Like it's not something that we wait for a paycheck for, you know. It's something that we have to jump up and take hold of with both hands the way Isaiah did, you know, every single day. And no matter what anybody tells us, and no matter what excuses we come up with ourselves, like this is something that we have to have hearts for, to be so willing and so active to grab hold of. This makes sense? I'm gonna ask every time. Love that. Okay, cool. I think that's back to you then.
Mm-hmm. Yuri and Ak, do you guys want to make a break? Take a break?
Yeah, maybe if we
Just like
time of like questions, or if anyone has to like anything to add or ask or say, and then we can have a half an hour break.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'd like to hear from like at least 2 or 3 people, just like, I don't know, your thoughts or a question or whatever, and then yeah, we'll take a quick break. I feel like if I lean this way that you'll see me better, but I don't know if that's true. Like looking at the screens being like,
Hi.
hi.
Hey, Sarah.
Yeah, it's good.
Just something that I had when we started this teaching was when God calls you to responsibility, and if you respond.
Can you repeat this part because it phrased the last part? When God calls us, responsibility.
When God calls you, He's giving you responsibility, and if He's giving you responsibility, He's giving you the ability to respond.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, because he already created us with the potential of it. It's like it's up to us to go for this potential or just waste it, you know? Yeah.
I love that wording as well, like that, like our response to it is actually our responsibility.
Uh-huh.
You know, like it's not something anybody else can do for us. It's something that we have to be responsible for grabbing hold of and like taking care of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So true.
Thanks. Philippe Jeton.
I kind of I like the part when you told about God ever calling for us, even when we are broken and all of that. It kind of remind me one of the stories. I don't know if it's a biblical one or just something I've been told any other way about the broken vase that the man carried every day back home, and has two ones: one that is completely broken, and one that bring all the water. And the man decided to continue to use the broken one to and put seed on the side he was carrying it. And because of the vase was broken and pouring water on this side, it made the path beautiful for him to go home. Just remind me of this story.
Well,
It's a pretty cool video. Yes.
yeah, I actually love that. I think that's really. When you first started the story, I was like, "Where's he going with this?" But then I was like, "Oh wow!" Like, it's so true that God is really not limited
Mhm.
by like any of our own like limitations, and the things that we think of as weaknesses, are things that's where God's going to show up, and he loves to be so present in like our brokenness, and if we were perfect, like we wouldn't need him, and that wouldn't be okay. So it's a good thing that we're broken people, because then God can move, and then God can do that thing where he's not just planting along the path, so that we can see it, but also so that everybody who passes can see it. Like
Mhm.
that's such a strong picture. Love that.
I just had a quick question about when you're talking about hearing from God, because I feel like when I ask him questions, or I'm like, okay, God, so I want to hear from you now. Just tell me anything. I don't care. Just talk to me. I feel like I'm being quite prideful about it, because I'm literally sat like in quiet time. I'll have a few questions or something, and I'll be like, okay, God, I want to give this time for you. If you can talk, and then I'll just leave it, and I'll like sit there in the quiet and be like, and then just wait. And then I'm like, and then I'll 5 minutes later I'll be like, okay, come on, mate, I want to have some breakfast, but I feel like I'm doing it not wrong, but I feel like every time I do it, I'm like, well, what am I doing wrong? I'm not hearing you properly. Am I not opening my heart up enough? Am I not being vulnerable to hearing you in different ways, or And I don't know. I know it's not like a recipe book to like hearing the voice of God, but I feel like there's something that's like not quite right, that I'm not like open to. I don't know what your thoughts are.
But also God can reply. He can respond with silence sometimes. Like I said, there's no recipe to. It's not like a follow 5 steps until you hear God's voice. Those things. What I like in my journey, what I learned with God so far. Yes, the quiet place, like our place with God. How do you call it?
Like a secret place.
The secret place with God. Yeah, it's a place that we're gonna get a lot from Him, but like during the day, He speaks much more, like a lot more, not much more, a lot more. Because if not, we're gonna have only appointments with God, and He wants to be with us 24/7, not only 3 times a week during my quiet time, So the thing is, we need to be open for Him, and He's gonna speak to us, and there's not gonna be such a thing as whenever I want to hear, I'm gonna have the answer. We're not the bosses of God, and I know that it's not this that you're saying, but He's gonna bring a revelation to us when He wants. But the good thing is like being available. If you're open to listen to God's voice, He's gonna speak to you. And sometimes it's going to be a big thing that He's going to bring to you, and sometimes just bring a butterfly to just go and turn those. Could be just God tell you like good morning in a cute way,
Yeah, I was actually going to say something similar. Like we often put these expectations on God, and we're like, okay, well, I need you to meet me here. And you know what? Like sometimes there are questions where we're like, I need the answer to this question, and we feel like so desperate for it. But we also have to remember that like what God calls us to is to be with him, right? And so that often means that like maybe he doesn't want to talk about that right now. Maybe what he actually really wants is to just spend time with you. You know, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And we have to be able to be comfortable in the silence with God, you know, because that's what we are with friends, you know. Like if I'm the friend of God, then I'm not going to sit there and be like, hey, like we have an appointment, tell me everything that I need so that I can go, you know, like that's not how it works. But God he wants us to be familiar with him, you know, which does mean like reading the word and whatever, but it also just means spending time with him, you know, and that can be in the secret place, and it can be in the quiet times and whatever, but like he really just wants to be with you and know you. And I think from that place comes the answers to those questions. But first and foremost, we have to be so comfortable and so familiar with God. That makes sense? Cool.
I'll be right back.
Awesome. If there aren't any more questions, I think we're going to take a quick break. And then, yeah, we'll come back half an hour?
Yep. Let's do 4:15, and half an hour for people in the States.
Perfect. We will see you guys very soon then.